chose to do my final project on Bread Givers. It's a novel by Anja Jezierska. It's incredible. If I could describe it in very small terms, it's a mix between Little Women and The Diary of Anne Frank. In the way you read it, not in the events that happen. But there's one specific element in the story that fascinates me, and it's the fact that Sarah Smolinski is disillusioned with her success at the end of the book because of her college education, especially her studies in psychology, and the way it transforms how she sees herself and the world around her. So, as I said, Bread Givers is by Anja Jezierska. She is a they called her the Sweatshop Cinderella. She's very rags to riches story. She's a prolific author. She's written a lot. And Alice Kessler Harris, who is the one who wrote the foreword to this book, she is the one who sort of brought Jezierska back into the light. Her works were not in print anymore by like the 60s or the 70s, and then Kessler Harris found her stuff in a library and fell in love with the writing and wound up getting it republished under a different publishing company. Anyway, so Bread Givers is a lot like her other works. It's about the struggles of immigrants to achieve the American dream, but also the guilt facing those who, having achieved it, feel a loss of cultural belonging. So this story is told through the eyes of Sarah Smolinski, who is the youngest of 4 girls in a family of Polish immigrants. The overbearing patriarch, father, represents the old world with his religious zeal and insistence that God doesn't listen to women. Sarah, on the other hand, is the loud and ambitious new world, and this predictably leads to the clash of their personalities. Now, the Smolinskis live in a poor neighborhood of New York City called Hester Street. It's primarily filled with Jewish immigrants. Keep in mind, this novel actually takes place at the same time as The Great Gatsby, but this story tells a much different side of 1920s America. It tells it in the hardships that European immigrants faced. Sarah is one of many who made it into the middle class, but a lot of people really didn't. Namely, those such as father and mother, who were too old at the time of their immigration to adjust to new folkways and mores. So this story tells Sarah's journey up the social ladder, beginning her life under father's rule on Hester Street, then following her as she watches her sisters' lives be ruined by father's matchmaking. She runs away after her father makes yet another bad business decision that brings them to financial ruin, and after a long period of living in a tiny apartment and working full-time while going to night school, she makes it into college. Once there, she finds that all the hardships she faced on Hester Street are actually invaluable assets to her learning, specifically in psychology. Instead of merely experiencing and responding to rushes of emotions, this new knowledge of human psyche causes Sarah to view the world through a new, critical lens. Now, we start with Sarah's ambition. This sort of really manifests after Masha's tragedy. Masha is her second sister, and after she is denied her love and her suitor for father's political and financial gains, she begins to think inside herself, Sarah does, and instead of merely observing in the moment, she wants to learn something, to do something. She also mentions wanting an American-born man who is his own boss, and who lets her be her own boss. And I'm quoting from the book, "No fathers, no mothers, no herring." In Justifying Individualism, Anja Jezierska's Bread Givers, Martin Japtok, the author, focuses on the divide between individualism and communalism as being a main theme of this novel. He uses the example of the Yiddish vernacular spoken by the family, and points out that Sarah doesn't speak in this dialect in the latter half of the novel. Now, she, as a character, has always been, let's say, precocious, but it is stark that in the last half of the novel, she starts to speak in a little bit more American dialect and uses bigger words and speaks in more luxuriant sentences, we would say. But from the beginning of the novel, Sarah is conspicuously different from her sisters. Not only is she the only daughter not to be in an arranged marriage, she also shows her nickname, Blut und Eisen, which means blood and iron, when she industriously decides to go out and peddle something to get money for her family. Now, this happens when they have nothing. They have maybe some potatoes and some potato peelings to eat, and they have nothing else, because work is so bad in 1920s America, especially for immigrants. And so she decides to take some money that they had been given by a friend and go out and try to peddle something and get them something to eat. So she decides to go out and she gets some squashed herring from a friend. Funny enough, the friend who gave them the money, she buys some herring, refuses to accept it on charity. She wants to pay for it herself, and goes out into the square and loudly yells, "Herring! 2 pennies for a herring!" And everyone is, I would assume, so charmed by this little girl that they decide to buy from her, and she makes 50 cents, which is 25 cents profit. Now, prior to this, as a kid, she had said to herself, if she ever got a little bit of money, she would run away, and she would never look back. However, when she has this money, instead of doing that, she says she wants to go home and share this wealth. She wants to show them what she's done. She's proud of her accomplishments, and the first thing she wants to do is share it with the people that are closest to her and who share her history and know her. And so this kind of sets her apart from her sisters, who merely live in the moment. Sarah acts upon the moment. The other sisters hate father just as much as Sarah does, but there's one difference. Sarah, as I said, acts on it, and doesn't allow herself to be acted upon by father's religious zeal. Philip Code, or Philippe, he points out this difference in his essay, which is called A Willing Embrace of the Shadow, Cultural and Textual Hybridity in Angie Gierska's Bread Givers. He explains how each sister, Bessie, Fania, and Masha, they have their own kind of escapism from father. Bessie is the workhorse, Masha is the solipsistic narcissist, and Fania is really just absent in the moment. But Sarah's way of, I guess, coping is just by changing her surroundings. She observes, but then she starts to realize this isn't what she wants. And when she eventually leaves home amidst great turmoil, she is nicknamed, instead of Blut und Eisen, she is nicknamed the Hard Heart by her father, because she's been having to harden herself in order to act upon these things that she wants to do. One particular element of Sarah's time on her own, when she leaves father and mother and goes out on her own, is when she goes to night school. And she proves herself to be a nuisance to the teachers and to the other students, because she stops the lecture to ask questions, and she talks, in class about the material, and she just seems to want to be a good student, which I guess they don't really want to deal with, because I know very well good students can be nuisances. But one specific time, she says, I don't want to learn all about these old dead philosophers and what they have to say. I want to learn the living life. And of course, ever after, she gets called the living life because everyone makes fun of her about it. But this kind of encapsulates her ambition. She wants to learn about the here and now, and she wants to live in the moment instead of always worrying whether she's not going to have food for the next meal. And the living life and living knowledge and living as an adjective is used a lot in this novel. And it really puts emphasis on how she thinks. How Sarah, when a suitor, Max Goldstein, leaves her apartment for the last time after she breaks up with him and doesn't, want to marry him, she hugs her books to her chest as if they were living things. So knowledge is alive to her. And whereas other people may seem to think knowledge is a means to an end, Sarah values knowledge for knowledge's sake. She wants to know, and that's what sets her apart from the others in college so much, is this burning ambition to know things and to gain more knowledge just for knowledge's sake. So the focal point of this novel comes whenever Sarah eventually gets to go to college. After slaving away in her little one-bedroom apartment, working in a laundry shop, and going to night school, Sarah finally makes it into college. And this is sort of like her dreams being achieved. She's so excited. Whenever she goes to school, she travels out of New York State. She goes, it's never really specified, but it's a very white suburban environment. And this sort of reminds her once again of her ethnic whiteness. In The Love of Color in Me, Anja Zierska's Bread Givers in the Space of White Racial Manufacture, it's a big title, but in this essay, Tyrone Simpson describes Sarah's body as a chief obstacle of her racial transformation. And racial transformation meaning her upward mobility and attempts to sort of assimilate to American culture. This is before she's made to code switch back into, her immigrant upbringing. This is whenever she is all gung-ho about being American, pretty much. This is really her only object, and goal is to gain a sense of belonging in America. So Tyrone Simpson says that her anger and refusal to take physical education, which is a class that's offered at the university, she's required to, but she doesn't realize it. She equates it to work and labor and says, are we getting paid for this? And they say, no, it's just a requirement. She shows so much anger at this that she actually goes to the dean and demands that the dean let her, skip out on it and not go, and he does. So this anger, it shows her unwillingness to conform to other ethnic groups who undergo physical labor, and also her times in Hester Street. She had to work, physical manual labor in order to survive. All of her family did, and now she's being expected to do it in a college setting. It's not. She shows anger and abject refusal to do that. However, her subsequent studies in psychology are a relief, as they teach her self-control and an ability to distance herself from her emotions. And it's interesting, actually, Simpson in his essay talks about how this is a sign of whiteness, is this disconnect from needs and wants, and asserting that self-control and self-discipline and almost a cold hardiness against it. Christy Launius points out a moment during her college schooling in her psychology class. So this is the focal point of the Bildungsroman, because it is the moment when Sarah stops seeing her time in Hester Street as a waste and a handicap and starts to see it as a tool and an experience. The students around her, once she realizes this, are transformed in her eyes into so many pink-faced children who never had to live yet. That's how she calls them. And actually, I'll read a quote out here. So if Mr. Edmund, the psychology teacher, says to the class, give an example from your own experience showing how anger or any strong emotion interferes with your thinking. And Sarah is actually reminded of a time on Hester Street that she remembers. And she says, my anger did not get the better of me now. I had learned self-control. I was now a person of reason. From that day on, the words of psychology were full of living wonder. I realized at the time when I sold herring in Hester Street, I was learning life more than if I had gone to school. When I went through those experiences, I thought them privations and losses. Now I saw them treasure chests of insight. So basically this talks about her realizing the wealth of knowledge that her growing up in such a hard life in Hester Street has given her. And it actually allows her to find peers in the older professors and older men living in the college. Because I knew more of life as a 10-year-old girl running the streets than these psychology instructors did with all their heads swelled from too much knowing. To them, my Hester Street world was a new world. So it's very interesting how in this moment, in this higher education moment, where she's been trying to deny her past and trying to move upwards from it. She thinks of this life, this journey from immigrant to American. She thinks it's an upward mobility journey, and now I think she's coming to realize it's more of a circle. So, an important part of her time in college is her time with the dean of the college. She talks to him a few times, and he gives her allowances, for example, with the physical education thing. But on page 232, Sarah asks him why he, as a privileged American, why he is allowed to be so soft and be nice to people and make allowances for everyone, whereas she, growing up, had to become hard and harden herself against other things. And he says, all pioneers have to get hard to survive. You, child, your place is with the pioneers, and you are going to survive. And so this final stretch in her education, because this happens a little bit later in her college years, it, according to Japtuk in his essay, he references this in Justifying Individualism, when he stresses Sarah's innate individualism, calling this moment the ultimate justification for her selfishness/independence. The two have become indistinguishable at this point in the novel. And so it goes back into that individualism versus communalism, and the fact that in order to be an immigrant and also pursue this life and be an individual, you have to get hard in order to survive. You have to become the hard heart, which is actually the new nickname that her father has for her when she leaves. And this moment sort of helps to reassure Sarah that this is the right thing to do. That even though it is hard for her, and it is way harder for her than it is for any of those pink-faced children that she sees, it is worth it in the end because she is going to survive. So, near the end of this novel, Sarah graduates college. She wins an essay contest talking about her life in the university, and she is on cloud nine. Then we go into the third book of this novel, and she returns to Hester Street, but under vastly new conditions. She goes on the train first class. She goes to an expensive department store and picks out everything she wants. And she is basically living the life of a working, middle-class American, which to her is luxury. Which obviously goes into the ending of the novel, where she goes back to Hester Street and she teaches in a school overlooking the square in Hester Street, and she winds up meeting the principal of the school, who is an Americanized Jew like herself, and falls in love with him and decides to make him her lover. And during this time, her mother passes away, and her father remarries. And Sarah finally, I think, sees her father not necessarily as this cruel tyrant, but more as a man who is struggling to fit in with the new world, but can't, because he so embodies the old world. Gay Willents, in Cultural Mediation in Bread Givers, which is her essay on this, posits the ending to this novel not as an American success story, but as a Jewish lament. The cultural mediation that has been so sought after by Sarah is finally, as Willents says, proving untenable. So Sarah's realizing all of her ambitions to be American and thinking of how easy it will be is really proving to be untrue and very difficult, because she's suffering from this guilt of not only leaving her family in pursuit of education, but also guilt at her loss of identity, or wondering if she will lose the identity. Code switching so much between these two worlds. So, The Old Bird and Drag Me Back by the Hair, Unsatisfying Endings in the Autobiographical Fiction of Anja Jezierska is an essay, another long-winded one, by Geraldine Craver that focuses on using Freudian theories to explain the endings in many of Jezierska's works. Freud's Totem and Taboo, specifically the fourth chapter, is used, which is in the form of a myth about a father and his sons. It's four parts. So first, the father expels his rebellious children. Second, the expelled children slay and eat the father. 3, by devouring the father, the children accomplish their identification with him, and each acquires a part of his strength. And 4, tender impulses reassert themselves, and what the father's presence had formerly prevented, the children now themselves prohibit. So, this myth encompasses a lot of Sarah's journey from father. So first, the father expels his rebellious children. Sarah speaks out against him. She is Blut and Eisen. She is the hard heart. And the father says, you don't like it, get out. And so she does. She runs away. The second, the expelled children slay and eat the father. So Sarah decides to pursue an education and basically that weakens the strength of father against her, because she is independent and she doesn't need him anymore, and he existed to be needed and to be over, to assert his dominance over the others. 3, by devouring the father, the children accomplish their identification with him, and each acquires a part of his strength. So Sarah's college years is really, it's very symbolic of her devouring of father. And because he, with his holy Torah, is a religious zealot, he is obsessed. And we see a lot of this in Sarah, actually, whenever she tells mother that she cannot visit her because she has school. And I can visit you anytime, but I can only go to school right now. And even at one point, one of the sisters says, "You are just as bad as Father with his holy Torah." And so that's how Sarah is acquiring a part of his strength and his obsession with knowledge. And then 4, tender impulses reassert themselves, and what the father's presence had formerly prevented, the children now themselves prohibit. This talks about Sarah's return to the, Hester Street, and Hugo Selig, he is Americanized, but he's also a Jew, and they bond over the fact that they both grew up in Poland, or at least they both were born in Poland and came over very young. And then they eventually have Father move in with them. And this is completely... It's proven the novel to be very cyclical. And actually, this is very reminiscent of the time when Sarah was younger, in the very beginning of the novel, and she has that money that she's gotten from selling the fish. She said to herself before that if she ever would get a little bit of money, she would run away and never see her family again. But instead, when she has that money, all she wants to do is share it. She wants to share the wealth and share her fortune with those she is closest to. And we see this as well at the end of the novel, the actual ending of the novel, where she invites Father to come live with her, is her sharing the wealth. She said if she ever got a little bit with her, then she would run away, and she did. She ran away, got an education, became a school teacher, and came back. And now she is sharing the wealth. So, in conclusion, yes, Sarah is very disillusioned. She has a lot of guilt about leaving her family, specifically her mother. She also has learned as Tyrone says, the very white trait of disconnect from reality and disconnect from emotions. And I think that really plays a powerful element in this. Instead of reacting, she is processing and then responding based on that. And that quote at the end where, the old burden dragged me back by the hair, and the shadow of the generations that made my father, or that sort of a thing, that's a very weird and dark way to end a story. But I think it really does make sense, because Sarah is finding that no matter how much she works to rid herself of the old world, as much as she represents the new world, whereas Father represents the old, there really is no way to fully break free. But I do think this is a realistic ending, because even though Hugo Selig is her happily ever after, Jezierska makes sure to let us know that's not the end of the story. And I guess to sum it all up, her schooling and her college years really made a difference on how Sarah perceives and responds to the world around her. And the biggest difference is that even though she did return to Hester Street, and even though she is sort of becoming again a part of the old world in her courtship of Hugo and her allowing Father to live with them, she herself is different. Her identity has changed so that the space around her may be the same, but she is acting in a different way within that space. And I think that's a really important thing to understand in order to really understand the character of Sarah Smolinski.